Everybody knows of the TV show known as Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. We grew up with it since we were little and it has always made us smile and giggle. With the wacky antics from the many strange creatures known as imaginary friends, who were the creation of children's imagination. One of the main characters who works in the Foster building is Frankie, a 22-year-old girl who is the granddaughter of the Foster's home, Madam Foster. She is usually in most episodes, whether it's a major or minor role, but is otherwise an often occurring character. But despite the story's very happy theme, there's a darker side many people don't know of. The magical land of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends is little more than a figment of Frankie's imagination. Frankie Foster had autism. She grew up completely alone. She had no friends in her school and her parents barely paid her any mind. So, out of loneliness, she created an imaginary friend to keep her company. His name is Mikey. Mikey looked like a large teddy bear with soft cuddly fur and big adorable eyes. He was Frankie's only friend. While the other children played jump rope or played kickball at recess, Frankie and Mikey were in the back of the playground talking and playing. By 1937, Frankie was around 11 years old and she still had Mikey at her side. But having an imaginary friend in junior high made her only laugh at more. Though, Frankie paid them no mind because she loved Mikey more than anything. However, her teacher began to notice Frankie's still childish way and talked her parents about seeing a therapist. Frankie and family went to the therapist the next day and observed Frankie and Mikey. Frankie was terrified out of her mind, fearing what the strange people wanted with her. But Mikey continued to comfort his friend by hugging her in his big and fuzzy arms. Back in reality, Mr. and Mrs. Foster were given a vial of pills by the therapist. He had told them that once Frankie took this, her imaginary friend would be gone for good. Once the Foster family had gotten home, Mrs. Foster crushed the dosage of pills into a fine powder and mixed them into Frankie's chocolate milk for dinner. And unknowingly, Frankie had consumed the dosage each and every night. As the poor girl was given the pills, Frankie began to see less and less of Mikey. He didn't go to school with her as much. He wasn't there on the blacktop at school gate to giggle at her jokes every day, and he wasn't there to cuddle and hug each and every night. Until one day, Mikey was gone forever. Distraught at losing her only friend, Frankie began to go into a shell. She would not speak to anyone. She would spend hours after school standing on the blacktop to see if her friend would come back, and she would get up in the middle of the night to sneak out and look for him. One day, Frankie had seen her mother crushing the pills and putting them in her chocolate milk. Curious, when Mrs. Foster left the room, Frankie walked into the kitchen and pulled the vial of pills from the counter and very slowly read the label. Pills for Foster Frankie. Give 2 pills daily. Or stop visions within 2 weeks. Then after hearing a shout, Frankie turned to see her mother standing in the doorway of the kitchen, her face red with rage, shouting words that Frankie could not understand. But hearing the hostile and scary tone in her mother's voice, Frankie's eyes began to water up in tears as her mother shouted more and more until she snatched the vial of pills from Frankie's hands, before smacking her small child across the face, and then her yelling had finally stopped. A great red welt covered the side of Frankie's face as her mother tried to soothe her. But Frankie screamed like a banshee and ran out the door. As she ran down to the room in the dimming sky, Frankie made her way to the rundown section of her town. Most buildings of this section were either abandoned or so run down that many people didn't inhabit the place. Slowing down for exhaustion, Frankie has now scared. With the scary run down buildings and the slowly approaching darkness, Frankie had not a clue of what to do until she turned around. Before, he were a gigantic house, looking almost like a great castle. Its many colored, but slightly shabby. Multiple colored paint that decorated the walls made it look absolutely beautiful. Smiling with a large stupid-looking grin, Frankie had run out of the front step into the great house and opened up the broken front doors. Inside were many kids of old furniture, covered in layers of dust, holes from moths and rats and the odor of mildew. It looks like a haunted mansion to the normal person. But to Frankie, this was a wonderland. About 2 weeks later, the effect of the pills eventually wore off, but despite of this, Mikey never returned to Frankie. Rather than be sad that her old friend was gone for good, Frankie decided to make her new friends to keep her company in her new mansion. Soon, the friends we know the love began to surprising up. Blue, Wilt, Coco, Eduardo, Mr. Harriman, and many, many more. But what about Mac and Madame Foster? Mac was a depiction of Frankie's possible younger brother. Around 1933, when Frankie was 7, Mrs. Foster was expecting her second child. Frankie's parents wanted to try to have another child in hopes that they could have another normal child. The entire Foster family was thrilled to have another child, including Frankie. But by the time the baby was due, something went horribly wrong during childbirth. The umbilical cord has gotten wrapped around the baby's neck like a noose, and it was suffocated to death. Despite the baby dying, the family gave it a name, Mac. And because of this incident, Mac was an image on what Frankie's younger brother would have been like if he had alive. Madame Foster was based on Frankie's actual grandmother. She acted almost like Madame Foster, sweet, funny, and a bit odd. Frankie's grandmother loved Frankie dearly, even if she was mentally handicapped. She often made a cookie and sweet for Frankie, or little toys. But in 1936, when Frankie was 9, her grandmother was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. She died 6 months later. Many years had passed, and Frankie is still alive in the great mansion, making many more imaginary friends to fill her home. Many crazy antics filled their days in the home, and she was happier than she had ever been in her life. She was truly happy. But all that was about to change. In the early 1950s, the town had ordered the mansion to be demolished, so a playground can be built over the large amount of the real estate that covered the property. Many people objected to the demolition of the house, as it has existed for almost 200 years, but little could be done and the house was to be torn down. One day in 1952, while Frankie was trying to stop Blue during one of his goofball antics, a large wrecking ball and construction crew were coming down to the road, driving up onto the large lawn. The large iron ball was swinging back and forth. Frankie was chasing Blue until she stopped in front of a large window and saw the wrecking ball hurtle towards her. That was the last thing she ever saw.